Wu Ji called himself the best assassin among the eastern lands. He walked calmly, and looking at his well-wishers through the glazing of his glass, arrogantly sipped his wine. He absolutely doesn't care who his opponent was. At that moment one of the spiteful critics opened fire from a machine gun in his direction. Ji took no more than 5 seconds to deal with anyone, looked confidently in their direction. The bullets seemed to fly through him, but one still hit a glass of wine, as a result of which it broke and the wine spilled on the floor. Suddenly, he pounced on the gang leader, and eliminated him with just one blow, stabbing him in the neck. Just as easily and naturally, he eliminated the remaining participants in the massacre, because he mastered absolutely all types of weapons. It was as if he had calculated everything in advance, and having set everything up as an accident, he blew up a floor in the building. With a smile on his face he withdrew. Having seen, and even more so heard, an explosion on one of the upper floors of the house, the distraught people on the street rushed into panic. Wu Ji watched with pleasure what was happening from the side, and walked along the wires as if on the ground. Full of self-confidence, he talked about how he liked this lifestyle. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain inside, being perplexed and not understanding what happened. He found himself flying down, gradually his eyes filled with blood. He was tormented by the question of who could have killed him. Swiftly soaring down, Ji saw the silhouette of a girl unknown to him standing on the same wires. Gradually her image blurred, he heard a booming voice, as if someone said in his head that this was too banal an ending. A masked man appeared in front of him, calling himself a system of murderous intentions. He offered to find the killer, in return, by completing several tasks. He was transported to different worlds, in each of which there was always someone who wanted to brutally kill. Accordingly, his task was to catalyze or exterminate such insane characters. Since he didn't have much choice, he naturally accepted the offer. He felt like a toy in the hands of the devil, and understood that he would have to plunge headlong into the cycle of murder. Meanwhile, he was still brought back to life, which was certainly a plus. He couldn't help but be happy about it. He also found that his life might become more interesting. She asked to let her go. While they were tearing her clothes, he unceremoniously went live and filmed everything on his phone. One of them said to press her against the wall. She still begged not to do this, but the onlookers who wrote comments liked it. The excellent student was told that she might not hope for help, since they were in summer school. At that moment, he asked her if she was trying to help him by bringing a volunteer into the classroom. The bully grabbed the naked volunteer by the hair and said that excellent student Jiang was looking for him. Wang Wei kicked him, repeating that he needs to hurry up, because she is calling him. Wu Ji, gritting his teeth, lay on the cold floor, and Jiang did not know how to help him. He extended his hand to her, saying that he didn't want all this. In response, she silently looked at him with tear-stained eyes. Ji tried to reach the poor excellent student with his hand, saying that he was forced. They continued to film all this on camera, where comments from immoral individuals flowed like a river. Van hit the teacher again, who this time fell and hit the radiator. One of the accomplices noticed that Wei had overdone it, and Ji might not live to see tomorrow. He replied that no one cared about him. The teacher apologized to Jiang for not being able to help her. Wu Ji sat by the radiator and was bleeding. He was angry, but could not influence the situation. Wang grabbed Jiang by the hair and brazenly declared that no one could help her. Suddenly Ji's consciousness became clouded, images blurred in his eyes. The killing intent system activated the transfer since the Ji carrier was dead. He did not understand what was happening to him, whether he died or was alive. At this time, Van and his company continued to bully the excellent student. He told her that she could scream as much as she wanted. Suddenly Jiang screamed, "Why are they doing this to her?" Around, a crowd of schoolchildren just stood and watched what was happening. Wei answered her that he wanted justice for the weak, so now she would take their place, and urged her not to kick. He added that if she was an obedient girl, nothing would happen to her. At some point, Van felt that someone was standing behind him. He saw Wu Ji dressed in a cloak, and ordered him to come closer. Ji sighed with relief. He realized that this was his first task. The masked man answered him that it was necessary to suppress the violence in this school in 72 hours. He also added that as a former assassin, this is a fairly simple task. Ji replied that he could prepare the next task for him, and got to work. He took a filled flask with an unknown chemical substance and said that in 30 seconds, everyone in this room will die, and poured the contents into another flask with a certain substance. Wang asked what Ji was muttering under his breath, the masked man thought it was clever to use mercury fulminate. He also added that Ji cannot harm other people. At this time Wei said that it is better not to anger him. He replied to the masked man that he was a law-abiding citizen and could not harm people. Wang tried to hit Ji. The flask with fulminate of mercury rolled off the table, an explosion occurred. Ji noticed that no one was responsible for accidents. Enraged and bloodied, Van lay on the floor, looking at his burn on his hand, screaming in pain. The murderous intent system thought that Ji took advantage of loopholes in the rules. He noticed that Ji is an ideal carrier, and with him his plan will go flawlessly. But he noticed that if Ji gets innocent people involved, this will directly affect his resurrection. He asked the masked man in surprise if they were innocent, and pointing to Wei's gang of thugs who mock the weak, he asked if he meant them, or those who stand aside. The mask replied that they are innocent except for the target. Ji noted that he has interesting standards. At this time, Ben was rolling on the floor and writhing in pain. His accomplices simply looked at what was happening. Wayne screamed and urged them to kill Wu Ji immediately and not stand there like a pillar. Ji carried out a lightning-fast series of attacks towards the idiots, shocked by his sudden strength. Standing behind them, he watched as they screamed in wild pain after his blows. Ji thought about the fact that they pushed around their classmates with impunity, and besides, they had illegal drugs. He realized that most likely the target of his mission was not among this crowd. He continued to reason, in addition to the fact that he should not involve innocents, he also has a time frame. Suddenly Wu Ji remembered the poor excellent student. He turned towards her. He looked at her pitifully. In response she looked at him, and did not know how to thank him. Ji noted that he could not even think that they would meet so soon, even in such a situation. He extended his hand to her, and stroking her hair, said that she should thank her luck for such a coincidence of circumstances in which he was in the right place at the right time. He added that just a couple of days ago, he was the best assassin in the Dragon Country. How it was absolutely unimportant to him who his target was and what he was doing. Ji recalled how in just 5 seconds his target died from an accident. And now, he is no longer the same person he was for so long ago, and how did he get into such a situation? He was tormented and at the same time amused by the thought that he was dead, and found himself in such conditions. And the most interesting thing is that everything happened as always, and nothing foreshadowed his death. And how he was given a chance to find his killer by a masked man who called himself a system of murderous intentions. Ji found this interesting, and at the same time unusually suspicious. The mask said that he wanted to encourage his observation skills and reward him with the title ahead of schedule. Wu Ji was in thought and looked at the excellent student Jiang. Suddenly, the masked man showed Ji's character panel that appeared in front of him. It indicated everything: name, gender, age, goal, rank in the form of a student, and the countdown of time for the task. Wu Ji was extremely surprised that he had the title of disciple, which he clearly did not consider himself to be. Ji's vision improved. It began to digitize everything that happened around him. He looked around. Information about any object was displayed to him, from what and when the object was created, in the form of holograms. Ji realized that due to the low level, the skill is not very useful. The mask confirmed that as the level increases, his abilities will improve. Suddenly, Wu Ji called out a voice, asking him what was going on, and what was that deafening sound. It turned out to be the voice of the school principal, to whom Wang declared that Ji wanted to kill them all. At this time, he realized that raising his level is not so difficult. He needs to study the object more carefully. You also need to master the skill of observation, which is more characteristic of a scout than a killer. At that moment the director was yelling at him. Ji ignored the angry director in every possible way. He was thinking about his task. The director said that Ji would explain to his parents what happened. Ji looked at him, reading the information about him. He played along with the director, who responded by saying that there was no need to curry favor with him, and someone would have to answer for what happened. Ji said that someone should be held accountable, but we are talking about responsibility for the photos on the director's computer. The director wondered how Ji knew about the photographs and asked what kind of explosion it was. He replied that it was an accident. With his wound already bandaged, Wang declared that it was Ji's doing and called on Director Liu to detain him. Suddenly, Jiang became blunt for Teacher Wu, saying that in this way he was protecting her. The director noticed her torn clothes and didn't know how to react. Seeing Director Liu's reaction, Ping curled up and curled up. A cry with the name Ping was heard from the crowd. It was her friend Yu Lian rushing to the rescue. She ran up to Jiang and asked if she was okay and what happened here. You said that Ping went through a lot to protect her, and the bullying passed on to her. Jiang replied that she was fine. Their conversation was interrupted by a screaming Wang, who was trying to influence Director Lu. He shouted at Ziyuan without any respect, reproaching him for not believing him. Lu began to think that if he angered Father Wang, then there would be no more money for construction. He was looking for a way to get rid of Ji. Wei kept putting pressure on the director, hinting at his incompetence in this situation. He accused Ji and Jiang of obscenity, which he said was evidenced by their appearance. Addressing the crowd of classmates, Van asked to confirm the above. Everyone began to look at each other, realizing what awaited them if they did not confirm Wei's words. One of them still dared to take Van's side and said that he was telling the truth. The director said that now everything is clear to him, and he will take the necessary measures. Director Lu Ziyuan was pleased with himself and how the situation was resolved. He turned to Ji and Jiang and said that he would no longer tolerate their presence. Ping said that everything was wrong and he was lying. Yu Lian confirmed her words, saying that Jiang is not like that. Ji noted that tears should only be shown to a loved one, and he added, but not in front of these dregs of society, since they are not worth it. They looked at each other. Wang turned to Ji, saying that he did not dare to contradict him, and there was no point in competing with him. Teacher Wu sarcastically took out his phone, with video recordings of his bullying Jiang. Wang wondered when Ji managed to take his phone while he was showing the contents to the director. Wu turned to those classmates who came to Van's defense and said that they were shameless liars. In response, they burned with shame and did not know what to do or what to say in their own defense. Ji put his hand on the director's head and asked if he would make the right choice. Teacher Wu looked into Principal Lu's eyes ominously and repeated the question. Ziyuan caught himself thinking that he was afraid of Ji. For some reason it seemed to him that if he disobeyed, then death would await him. Director Lu quickly headed towards the exit. Wang, in turn, unsuccessfully tried to stop him. Ziyuan approached Wei and hit him, which made him simply bewildered. He accused Wang of violent bullying, and ordered the guards to escort him to the dormitory and contact his parents. Wei shouted back that the director would no longer receive money from his father for construction, and again accused Ji. Lu urged the others to prepare for the next lesson, after which he asked Ji if he had made the right choice. Wu replied that he had already sent a message about his heroic deed, along with photographs, to the Department of Public Education. Lu was in shock. He begged not to do this. Jiang looked after the leaving teacher, and did not understand when he managed to change so much. Yu Lian offered Ping to take her to the dormitory. Jiang agreed without hesitation. At this time, the departing Wei shouted towards Ji that he would not get away with it so easily. Van saw his classmate in the corridor, who also paid attention to him. Wei smiled at him, and gradually retreated into the distance under the escort of guards. Suddenly Van began to kick and shout that he would find the way himself, and there was no need to follow him. He didn't know how to calm down his hatred of Ji, and was looking for a way to deal with him. Meanwhile, Wu Ji was walking through the park. He realized that he had 71 hours left before completing the task. Suddenly, a notification popped up saying that Chu's formation was 80% complete. The mask appeared and said that he liked Ji. On the first task, he had already set Chu in motion. Wu asked what kind of formation Chu was. He replied that a person who intended to kill could turn into a Chu monster, and when it is 100%, someone will die. The masked man said that he was interested in how the former assassin would cope with Chu. Wu replied that he was also curious. He also added that when he sees Chu, Ji will understand that an ordinary person cannot cope with him. At this time, from the window of a high-rise building, the same monster Chu was watching them. His eyes were burning. He wanted to kill Wu Ji. He repeated this to himself again and again. Ji and the mask seemed to feel that someone was watching them. They turned around and Wu asked the man in the mask what it was. He stood in a stupor, and did not understand the feeling that took possession of him. To which the system of murderous intentions replied, nothing special and it's time to get down to business. Meanwhile, sunset had already come. The sun was setting lower and lower, going beyond the horizon. Finally, a cool night came, which enveloped the city in its mystery. Wu Ji lay on the bed and could not sleep. A mask hovered carelessly in the air above him. Ji decided to use his abilities again to finally verify their effectiveness. The mask stopped, realizing that Yu was testing skills, but if you want to live longer, you should not use unknown skills. At this time, Ji revealed the full potential of his abilities. He noticed that the study skill works within a radius of 3 meters, and understanding is limited mainly to memories. He wanted to check that if he combined previously known information. I also noticed that the new data goes beyond the limitations of innate skills and memory. Ji studied the bird sitting on a tree branch, accordingly all the information about it appeared. The radius and time of use depends on the mentality. At the moment, the time of use is approximately 5 seconds. Ji realized that his mental abilities were below average, and did not take risks. The mask understood that Wu was better than previous carriers. Ji said that he wants to use the ability on a completely safe person. He went to the mirror. The mask realized that Wu meant himself when he spoke about a safe person. There were 54 hours left. Ji noticed that for the experiment, the body of the deceased in which he is now located is an ideal material. He peered into the reflection of his eyes, and used the ability to study. He was shown all the information about the deceased, where it was said about entering his memories. Ji was surprised. He thought that he automatically acquired all the memories. The system of murderous intentions suggested that he check it to make sure of this, which you did. Ji said that it was amazing how he could observe past events from the perspective of God. The mask smiled in response. The mask added that there is excess information in short-term memory. You realize that areas in the fog are information that he did not perceive. Ji watched as he went to work as a volunteer in high school to gain experience. Wu wanted to find someone who worked in the shadows. His dream was to work as a teacher, because during school he had a hard time. At that time, he did not give up thanks to the support of his teacher, and he, being a teacher, wanted to help students. Suddenly he stopped because he saw that the girl was being bullied by a crowd of teenagers led by Wang Wei. The poor girl was beaten, her clothes were torn and she was crying. He stood up for her, restraining Van's hand. He asked why they were bullying their classmate. In response, Wei kicked him hard, knocking him to the ground. Lying on the ground, the teacher tried to cover his face with his hands from the blows. Van asked where he came from and why he was meddling in other people's affairs. The teacher urged him to calm down, saying that he had no right to do this. The beaten teacher came to Principal Lu Ziyuan to resolve the issue. He reproached him for indulging students who offended their classmates. The director called for calmness of the teacher by raising his hand in front of him, with a characteristic palm position, which was a stop signal. Adjusting his glasses and looking smart, he asked her what really happened. The poor, tear-stained girl did not know what to do in this situation. The teacher said that she could tell how everything really happened, and they would definitely help her. The girl started crying again. Without saying anything, Director Lu interrupted her. He said, since they have nothing more to add, then everyone can disagree, hinting that they need to be more reasonable. Ziyuan added, if he causes him problems again, then no one will vouch for his career. Most of the students stood in the corridor under the principal's office, trying to hear what they were saying. Suddenly the door opened, and Xiao Ku and his assistant came out of the office. Her friend ran up to Xiao and asked how she was feeling and what the director told her. Exhausted, Ku turned to Assistant Wu and apologized to him. In the following days, Wu was treated horribly by the disciples, who threw food at him, threw stones at him. He doubted whether he should continue to stand his ground, and how long it would last. But if he turns a blind eye to the beating of students by Van and his gang, it is necessary to simply not look in their direction and not pay attention to what is happening. He understood that an ordinary person would not be able to help children globally and would not protect everyone, when he suddenly got into a fight with Wei. Already beaten by Wang, Ji stood in the director's office and listened to his next curse at him. The director said that he regretted the decision to hire him as a volunteer, and because of him all the problems. Finally, Xiao began to speak, trying to tell how everything happened, stating that it was Wang and his gang who offended her, and the assistant stood up for her. Wei responded by saying that she was lying. Director Ziyuan asked Ku if everything she just said was true. He could not even think that all his efforts were not in vain, at least in this small and brave girl. It was clear from her how she became bolder by speaking the truth. She did not cry, and tried to look confident. But unfortunately this did not last long. After a while they reported that Xiao Ku fell out of the window. Everyone was shocked that rainy morning. Assistant Wu fell to his knees in front of her body. He bent over her, and not believing his eyes, tried to understand how this could happen. Van, passing by, told him that he was the next one to face a similar ending. He began to reproach himself for initially interfering in the affairs of Xiao and Wei. because it was after his attempt to protect Ko that this solution to the issue followed. Wu told Wei that this was his doing. In response Wang said that he had no evidence. He waited for the moment when Van came closer and attacked him with his fists. A moment later, his young thugs came to Wei's aid and beat up his assistant. The students simply watched. Wu understood that his weakness killed Xiao, and called on the others to fight them for the sake of other children. Meanwhile, morning had come, the sun was already visible over the horizon, and 48 hours remained before the completion of the task. The masked man asked him what he thought about it and what were his impressions of what he saw. Ji pitifully replied that he was too naive, a little stupid, and weak. He took his photo and said that although this guy is the most similar to him, he still doesn't look like him, hinting that he is better. Ji also noticed that he was not disgusted with him at all, but on the contrary. And the last wish of a man should definitely be respected. The mask asked where he was going, because there was little time left for the task, reminding him that if he failed it, he would die. In response, he smiled and disappeared in an unknown direction. At this time, in the schoolyard, Wang's group, led by him, bullied an overweight student. He asked them to stop beating him, because he couldn't stand it anymore. They continued to beat him, saying that someone as fat as him should not feel the blows. One of the beatings leaned over to their victim and said that he should endure it, because in this way he would earn Van's respect. Ji came up from behind and said that he would never achieve someone's respect, as well as location. The bully began to threaten him, while the second one noticed that you had become something different. Ji hit one of them very hard, punched him in the face, blood sprayed. The impact was so strong that he literally flew into metal pipes. Ji said that now he can feel real strength for himself, and understand how much weaker he is than him. The students were forced to fight. One of the rowdies said that if he loses, he will clean the toilets. If he wins, they will not touch him for a week. As a result, one of the students won the fight, and another beaten victim lay on the floor. At that moment, one of the hooligans took a bottle in his hand and approached the beaten man. He told the victim that he had bet money on him to win, but he lost, and with a wave of his hand he smashed the bottle on his head. He continued to beat him, and urged him to get up and continue the fight. In response he said that he could not. The poor beaten boy lay and thought about why such people even live in the world, and others have to endure this. He continued to mentally call for help, and wanted everything to end quickly. Suddenly the front doors opened. Wu Ji stood on the threshold, full of confidence. He looked angrily at what was happening, after which he quickly headed towards the offenders. Coming down the stairs, one of them called out to him, impudently asking you if he wanted to participate in their club activities. In turn, Ji looked angrily into his eyes, making it clear that it was time for them to finish. Wu asked if this was his club activity and looked around. The students were frightened and were silent, swallowing their tongues. The instigator stood and grinned on the side with a bloody broken bottle. Ji approached the exhausted students and said that they have all the necessary skills to repel these hooligans. One of them replied that he couldn't handle them alone, and besides, he would get himself into trouble later. Ji replied that the matter was different. It was simply easier for him to beat up the weak and assert himself at his expense than to look his fear in the eye. Wu called him a weak-willed coward, which made him furious. Angry, he said that no one could cope with Van's gang, neither the teachers nor him. At that moment, another came up and asked what Yu was saying here. He held out the butt of his cigarette towards the teacher and told him to get out of here. Ji, coolly and completely at ease, grabbed his hand in which there was a cigarette butt. He looked up at him and looked threateningly, hinting that this was a bad idea. Fixing his hand, he reached out and pulled the smoldering cigarette butt from his fingers. Gradually he began to understand that he could not resist his strength. You said that before you rely on others, you need to understand what you yourself can do, and he twisted his arm, thereby bringing him to his knees. He asked to be let in, while Ji put out the cigarette butt on his tongue, and noted that smoking was harmful to health. Suddenly, the hooligans from Wang's gang shouted that Ji was in trouble. A masked man floating in the air and noticed that young people today are fearless and extremely self-confident. All the disciples were shocked by Wu Ji's incredible abilities. They froze in place with their mouths open, and watched as Wu, one after another, was scattered around the room. Around Ji, the hooligans lay beaten and bleeding, while he calmly shook himself off and headed towards the exit. Approaching the student, he said that he had done what should have been done, adding that he also needed to understand what should be done. The system of murderous intentions asked Ji if it was time for him to return to the task. especially since he had taken revenge for the previous carrier. Wu replied that what he was about to do was not at all like revenge. He just wants to remind all people of something very important. The masked man was extremely surprised by this decision. Had the killer really changed his character? In the schoolyard, the hooligans found another victim in the form of an overweight teenager who asked them to let him go. One of them said that he was simply unlucky, and that when he saw them he needed to stay away. Suddenly Ji appeared behind him, who said that they are like cockroaches, no matter how much you poison them, they appear again. In response, the bully chased away Yu, who in turn noticed that it was he who was in class yesterday. He screamed angrily and suddenly swung a rake towards Ji. Since Wu was lightning fast in his movements, and calculated everything in advance, he easily parried the blow, knocking away the rake so that only the stick remained in his hands, and the metal part flew up. After which, he immediately dealt him a heavy blow to the face. The discouraged scoundrel flew to the side and fell to the ground. At this time, the metal rake picked up speed and fell down. They landed right between the bully's legs, causing him to squeal like a child. His accomplices were already standing behind Ji. He calmly turned in their direction. They brazenly and laughingly said that they were not afraid of you, hinting that he would be in trouble. The hooligan stood and still smiled. The bushes began to move behind them. Soon, people from Wang's gang came to their aid, saying that they were waiting for Ji, because he had been running up all day. The students watching from behind were talking. Someone wanted to call the police, another said that for this they would later get punished by the gang. They surrounded you, and one of the hooligans noticed that he was in vain playing the hero, and that you still can't make a wall out of mud. Wu looked around, seeing pandemonium everywhere. He got ready. He repeated out loud that you really can't make a wall out of mud. At that moment they rushed at Ji, who had already managed to deal with one thing. Still with the same cool head, he dealt with the gang one by one. There were fewer of them. Blow after blow flew into their empty heads. Suddenly one of them swung a wooden stick at Ji. He only managed to turn around. As the same student whom Yu was trying to reach had already dealt with him, Ji saw how he stood up for him and was pleasantly surprised. Trying to catch his breath, the guy himself did not believe what he had just done. Wu asked him if he was afraid that he would oppose them this time. The teenager grabbed his head and sadly admitted that he was actually afraid. But he noticed that teacher Yu was right. If you want to change something, you need to start with yourself. The hooligans from Wei's gang shouted that this kid would follow his teacher, hinting that they were the majority. At this time, another student grabbed a metal pipe and stood next to Wu. He stated that he would also help them. He was afraid but still dared to take this step. Gradually, from all sides, students began to converge into one group. Ji could not even think that they would still come to their senses. The teenagers came to the teacher's defense. The hooligans standing opposite were surprised by what was happening. Odin and the gang called on his accomplices not to be afraid, since there were still more of them. The disciples noticed that the wind suddenly changed. They stood, led by teacher Wu, among the beaten and humiliated gang members. At this time, a mask appeared and said that it had taken a lot of time to sort things out, and there were 40 hours left. He asked Ji what next. The rest of the students were extremely surprised by what happened. Ji and the teenagers who came to his aid led the beaten gang hooligans to school. They were met by an angry Van, in the company of his narrow-minded friends. Standing opposite with an angry look, he demanded an explanation from you for everything that was happening. Ji replied that he and the students were taking these hooligans to the classroom for educational work, since they started a fight on the school grounds. Wang Wei glared angrily at teacher Ji. He didn't know what to say. However, a moment later he threatened everyone who helps you, and that after he restores order here, he will deal with them. One of the students confidently answered him that no one was afraid of him. Wang was dumbfounded by such a statement, also from the students. Ji walked towards the front door of the school and pushed Wei aside as he passed. Van didn't know how to react. He felt humiliated. Furious, he kept repeating the name Wu Ji under his breath. Over time, rumors that Van and his punks were finished spread throughout the school. No one was any more afraid of Wei, who was watching Ji with his friends through the window. Xiaofan asked him what they should do next. Van answered him sharply that even without him he understood the situation they found themselves in. The gang brought a student to Wei. Wang asked him when everything would be ready. He replied that it would take time, since what he was asking for was guarded. Yelling in anger, Wei kicked the teenager hard in the stomach. Wang leaned towards him and stated that Wu Ji would not help him. He also added that his parents worked for his father, and if he disobeys, the consequences will be irreversible. To which the poor boy begged that Van would not touch his parents, and he, in turn, would get everything he needed. One of the gang members said that he would not wait for Wang's plan to work, and they would go and finish off Ji. Xiaofan tried to snap back when Wei suddenly stopped him. He absolutely calmly told him not to touch them or interfere, since nothing bad will happen if they cause him trouble before his surprise. Ji walked along the corridor, where his students greeted him and thanked him for his help. They asked him what kind of martial arts he was doing. A mask appeared, who said that the price of his heroism if the task was not completed would be his death. He added that Chu's formation had reached 98%, and in 2 hours it would be too late. Wu Ji snapped, saying that he knew what needed to be done. The masked man happily said that this was good. Ji went to the door of one of the classrooms and thoughtfully opened it. He looked for that same Jiang girl with his eyes, and having discovered her, he went to her. Teacher Wu came closer to her and asked if she had time to discuss something. Her smiling friend answered for her, pointing Pin's hands in his direction. She stood up and very embarrassedly said that she had the opportunity to talk. The mask told Ji that he would take care of the task and not flirt with her. Wu replied that she could be the biggest change in the task. Walking around the schoolyard, Ji asked Ping when Wang and the gang started bullying them. She replied that they had never been so sophisticated before. He looked at her with enthusiasm and sympathy. She drew attention to this. Suddenly Jiang asked him if there might be something on her face, because he was looking so closely. To which the smiling teacher Wu replied that her face was as beautiful as ever. At one point he approached her, gently stroked her hair, and asked if she knew him before. She was taken aback by surprise. She looked at him carefully again and asked if he was the same Wu Ji. They were transported to another dimension. She asked if he was number 1 in the list of killers. He replied that it was true. Taking out a knife she put it to Yu's throat. She said that only an idiot would be guided by this list, and if Wu interfered with her, then she would send him after the others. Having knocked out her knife with his own and putting it to her neck, he said that he was glad to have such mutual understanding at the first meeting. She was extremely confident and looking into his eyes, smiled back. Jiang gave him her hand. He, in turn, noticed that she was really friendly as they say about her. She said that friendliness exists only between equals. He assumed that he was the only one who achieved her favor. Returning to reality, Ji seemed to feel that they were being watched. In fact, someone cut the wire from the pole and started the motorcycle. Jiang also turned around and saw what was happening, which made her extremely surprised. Wu looked into her eyes and asked if she wanted to explain what was happening. They started dancing, and again found themselves in a parallel world, where they were at the ball. Suddenly, in the middle of the dance, he pulled her close to him and gently took her leg. She said that the opponents were at 4, 6, and 7 hours, 2 in each direction. He replied that it was the same for her. Having turned around in the dance, they began to actively fire at them with pistols. They seemed to merge into a single whole, dancing to a charming melody. Everything in the same harmony with the music. They shot the remaining scoundrels. She closed her eyes, and completely trusting Ji, as if she was entering a trance. In a beautiful end to the dance, he bent her over, holding her waist with his hand. While all opponents were defeated, he looked at her. She was beautiful, confident, and seemed perfect in this image. Suddenly they returned to the previous dimension, where she stood with her eyes closed. He realized that in fact it was not her. At that time the broken wire was heading straight towards them. Ji grabbed Jiang and jumped sharply to the side with her. The electrical wire flew past. They saw that a motorcycle was driving at them at breakneck speed, with no one driving it. Suddenly a masked man appeared and advised him to take cover from the motorcycle. At this time, an electric wire was spreading current throughout the area. You paid attention, because a characteristic noise was behind them, and everything sparkled. In front of them a motorcycle was flying without slowing down. It seemed that they were trapped. The system of murderous intentions was thinking out loud that he would have to look for a new carrier. He leaned Pin against him and smiled in response to the statement of the masked man. Wu Ji said that he gets hurt when he underestimates him. Wu decided to use the student's first skill, which was a pretty good idea. Using this ability, he cut off the necessary wires on the motorcycle, thus provoking him to explode, behind which were Ji and Jiang. From the windows of the school there were screams that the light had gone out, and there was some kind of loud sound. Ping caught herself thinking that teacher Wu moved his hand and there was an explosion. The students in the window shouted something had happened and wanted to go down to see. Jiang asked Ji who he was after all. He smiled and rather modestly replied that he was an ordinary person. The students did not calm down, they opened the window and found a fire below. What they were shouting about, Ji took Ping in his arms and disappeared with her in an unknown direction. Meanwhile, a student entered the chemical laboratory and promised Van a certain substance. Having made his way inside and finding the right locker, he took out what he needed from there. He understood perfectly well that this was wrong, but he had no choice. At this time, in Ji's apartment, he told the whole truth to Ping, that he was in the body of teacher Ji, in order to help them deal with Wei. The mask asked why he told. You replied that the rules do not prohibit. The mask added because a normal person would not believe it. Suddenly Jiang stood up and said that she understood everything, she had a request, and she would help. The masked man was surprised at her gullibility. You asked if she was afraid that everything was a lie. She replied that she and the teacher were different, there was no point in lying to him, she had no money, but for seduction. She became quiet, and then continued that there are other, much more effective ways to do this. She said that she believed him and wanted to help. Wu replied that he just had one small matter. Pin hurried him to tell him. He leaned closer to her and asked her to take care of him. Ji tried to use the student's second skill, mental connection, on Jiang. It was as if an electric current had engulfed Piner's head and body, but there was no pain. Her pupils dilated, she did not understand what was happening to her. The next day at school, Yu with a system of murderous intentions, went out into the yard. The mask said that he cannot go into the depths of mental space whenever he wants. He continued to say that when creating man, they divided him into ego and harmony of spirit with matter. The superego is responsible for moral attitudes, and the subconscious is responsible for the totality of instinctive drives. And in order to enter this space, you need to receive the approval of the ego of the other side, in the form of sympathy or death. Then it is necessary to confront the limitations of the superego, and only by breaking these chains can one enter the subconscious. It is necessary to avoid the influence of impulses and animal passion, and then you can explore the mental space of the other side. The mask was surprised how Ji was able to enter her space. In other words, she has no restrictions imposed by the superego. Is she really a saint? They watched as Jiang came to the girl's defense and, grabbing a stick, threatened the hooligans with violence. The masked man looked at her from the side, thinking that she really was a saint. Jiang turned to the girls, and calming them down, said that everything was fine. She introduced herself as Jiang Pinger, and asked what their names were. They continued to observe her relationship with the girls, who were already like friends. They ate at the same table, walked together. Suddenly Ji opened his eyes, an incomprehensible feeling did not leave him. He saw Jiang in front of him, worried about something. She looked confused. Ping said that Wu asked her to take care of him, and lost consciousness, after which she dragged him onto the bed. Ji turned to her and asked if she had any questions about what happened, or if he had found any clues. She replied that she trusted him, the only question was whether she helped him. The mask noted that her integrity was discouraging. He said that she certainly helped him, and he was able to figure out the purpose of the task. The masked man asked what he found out. Wu said that the purpose of the task was. Pin hurried him by asking who the target was. Wu Ji seemed to have an epiphany, he looked like he knew what to do next. Suddenly a message appeared that there was only 1% left before Chu was formed. The mask said that this is not how things usually happen. Ji decided to use the ability, the boundless ocean of knowledge. The masked man noticed that having obtained anomalous information, he was able to determine Chu's plans and even actions. He asked Ji why he didn't use this skill to find the target of the task. Yu replied that he tried, but could not find such information. And he assumed that the target was outside the school territory, or the ability did not give the required result. The mask was surprised how it could be that the ability of the title would not produce results. Ji answered silently. He headed towards the exit when Jiang rushed to catch up with him, asking where he was going. Meanwhile, a gang of hooligans led by Wei were drinking alcoholic beverages in the classroom. Van threw a can at the student, declaring that he would not smear himself with drink, reminding him that he should have brought what he asked for. Wei grabbed him by the throat, and with the words that he would die, tried to hit him. Ji suddenly appeared in the company of Ping, and ordered Wang to let the guy go. Wei squeezed his neck even harder, his eyes became bloodshot, he smiled and said that it was too late. He lifted him up and said towards Ji that he could watch his student die now. At this moment, Van felt nauseous. He began to realize what was happening. He and the others vomited blood. He asked how Yi Xiaofan dared to poison him. Then he slowly fell to the floor, trying to grab Xiaofan's clothes. He stood over his bloody body. The others lay just as lifelessly on the floor. Xiaofan grabbed his head. A tear rolled down from under his glasses. He said out loud that Van was dead and would not harm anyone else. He went crazy and repeated again that he was dead. Ji realized that Chu was actually not Wei, but this nondescript boy. Wu said that a person plunged into darkness will ultimately be completely absorbed by it. Pin screamed in surprise. Ji walked up to Xiaofan and coldly twisted his neck, even though he felt sorry for this guy. Xiaofan collapsed unconscious on the ground. Jiang, frightened, covered her eyes with her hands. Pin screamed at Teacher Wu, and before she could finish speaking, he interrupted her, saying that he only took pity on him. Suddenly, someone's voice said that he would not be able to get rid of Chu so easily. At this moment, the message about Chu's formation at 100% flashed. Ji turned around. He saw how the small body of a teenager turned into something big and terrible. Monster Chu stood in front of him, and smilingly said that Ji was in big trouble. Ji asked Jiang to leave here and not interfere. She was scared and worried about the teacher. With a sharp wave of his hand, he threw a pen at the monster, but this was not a very good idea, because when the tip of the rod flew into his eye, the pen did not injure him, but rather crumbled. What was he thinking? He didn't understand how the iron alloy feather didn't harm him in any way. The monster instantly hit Ji, who in turn flew to the side. Teacher Wu tried to hit Chu back, but Chu managed to dodge with lightning speed. Ji caught himself thinking that his speed and physical component had gained comprehensive strength. He applied an ocean of knowledge. He understood that his structure was still similar to that of a human. In the fight, they threw all the tables and chairs to the sides. The class was smashed to pieces. Ji tried to find his deadly weaknesses using his ability. Having generated a spear, you embedded it in his ear. The monster screamed in pain. Having created another one, he deftly got closer to it and stabbed it into Chu's solar plexus. Then, the next spear followed into the spine of the feral monster. However, no matter how hard Ji tried, he never managed to break through his vertebrae. Yu was surprised. A man in a mask suddenly appeared and said that it was not so easy to destroy this monster. He added that Chu is a work of art, each of which has characteristic attributes based on impulses. At that moment, Chu awakened his attribute, and as if with a blast wave, he knocked the teacher down. Thus, he made a hole in the wall through which Ji flew out into the street. Seeing teacher Wu Jiang shout his name, Ji tried to recover from the blow. Among Chu, the attribute he awakened is not considered extremely strong. The monster meanwhile was crawling out through the hole. But for a beginner it was extremely unpleasant, because its attribute was the strengthening itself. The mask noticed that Ji would not be able to cope with Chu, since his physical capabilities exceed those of humans 10 times. Pin called for help and asked someone to call the police. At this time, the monster looked at her and screamed fiercely. Chu suddenly rushed to run towards her. Ji understood that he was too strong. The monster was already halfway there when it jumped and pushed Jiang aside. Everything happened very quickly. Chu attacked him and tore off his hand. He couldn't dodge. The monster responded with a powerful blow. Jiang pitifully watched what was happening. She understood that she could not help him. Ji tried to cover his hand, but the monster hit him again. The teacher flew towards the trash cans, but was not going to give up. The masked man suggested that he give up and end this while he finds a new host. To which Ji replied that changing the feeder right in front of him is the height of indecency. Getting to his feet, Yu said that he had recently noticed something. The mask asked how he was going to fight in such a state. Ji used the boundless ocean of knowledge and began to study the strengthening itself. The mask stated that he did not want to watch himself being unwound into pieces, since he was going to use the reinforcement itself on himself. Ji said that he wouldn't get rid of him so easily, and exposed the remaining forearm to the monster's blow. He put together all the studies relevant to the use of self-strengthening, starting with throwing off the gecko's tail, finishing with the germination of pine, the previously studied information of crumbling plaster, and the plumage of a sparrow also helped. The mask noticed that Ji, with the help of the abilities of third-party objects, suppresses the influence of Chu's abilities. Already with a restored hand, which looked much more massive than a human one, rushed into battle with the monster. Chu, in turn, just as quickly rushed towards Wu Ji. The masked man was amazed by Wu's willpower. since an ordinary person would not have endured this terrible pain, especially the breaking of bones. Finally, Ji and the monster Chu clashed in mortal combat. The shock wave carried all the students along with Jiang to the side. The man in the mask said that he wouldn't last long, and his body might not be able to withstand such a load. He added that he would last a minute, or half a minute, or maybe even 10 seconds. They continued, unafraid of each other, to rush into battle more and more fiercely. Ji climbed onto the monster and at the same time beating him, replied that 10 seconds might be enough. Suddenly, Wu delivered an extremely strong blow, from which Chu drove off along the ground into the distance, leaving a characteristic mark. The monster was extremely surprised, he did not understand where and at what moment such power came from him. With about 8 seconds left, Ji trampled Chu into the ground, intending to kill him. The masked man noticed that he did not have enough strength to completely eliminate the monster. Ji asked the killing intent system, if there were 2 of him, would he be able to kill him? The masked man was surprised, because he understood what exactly Wu Ji was up to. The teacher decided to use his previously severed hand. He soared several meters into the air. He pulled his hand towards himself, which formed a kind of shield, and sharply rushed down at the monster. The mask noticed that he concentrated Chu's physical enhancement ability in one hand. There were no more than 3 seconds left. This was Wu Ji's last chance, and he was well aware of it. Characteristically grouped, Ji picked up speed and flew like a bullet. A moment later, Wu hit the monster with incredible power with a blow. Thus, he pierced him through, with a monolithic hand like a stone. The ground shook, Ji landed and stood up, his clothes torn from the massacre. He managed to defeat the Chu monster, which the mask did not doubt at all, who later put it this way and said that now he needed to kill the target. Ji noticed that he is now weakened, and his physical abilities do not even reach 1% of the peak of his strength. The masked man assured you that this would be more than enough, given his abilities and the fact that the target was an ordinary person. Ji thought that it would still not be as easy as it might seem. At that moment Jiang called out to him. She joyfully ran up to him and said, "It's good that everything is fine with him." The mask noticed that he had achieved success on all fronts. He asked if he didn't want to know who the target of the task was. He replied that this person was here. Pinner was standing nearby, when suddenly Ji felt something, some discomfort. Suddenly she hit the teacher. You didn't understand what was happening. Jiang said, who would have thought that his naivety would be so charming. Being completely confused, Wu Ji asked her if it was her. The students crowded around them. Ji tried to calm Ping. Jiang's girlfriend suddenly showed up and asked him how he was feeling. And what does it feel like to have a knife in the back, whose student he so recklessly trusted all this time? Even the masked man was confused and didn't understand what was happening. She continued to say that people initially seem completely different, until the moment you get to know them better. Ji pulled out a piece of glass stuck in his hand, blood spilled. He threw the fragment in her direction, saying that she was the person who secretly provoked everyone to violence. Ji thought that perhaps this was the decisive moment. Yu Lian replied that she was quite offended to hear such things from him. At that moment it was covered by one of the students, who was hit by a glass shard. She said that it was he who disturbed her peace and broke into her Garden of Eden, ruining all her toys. Everyone behaved strangely, like a zombie. The mask said that something was wrong here, and that the person he hit didn't make a sound. And nothing surprises anyone, not even Chu's corpse. Lian smilingly replied that she had hypnotized them all. The mask was surprised and asked her if she was talking to him and how she could see him, adding that Ji was clearly unlucky. It dawned on him, she is the original carrier, people like her are born extremely rarely. Ji asked how long she had been waiting for this moment. You said that it all started with that incident in chemistry class, and she didn't have to wait that long. In addition, he himself wanted to get to her, and she, as a devoted student, could not allow him to do everything himself. At that moment, students with sticks rushed at Ji, fighting them off. He said that she was probably offended to see how he destroyed everything. She urged him to be careful, because girls don't like someone as angry as him. Ji continued to scatter the hypnotized students around the schoolyard. The masked man noticed that they continued to get up and attack further after they were knocked out. Yu Lian stated that as long as they were alive, they would obey her, and Assistant Wu was not allowed to kill people. The mask did not understand how she knew that he could not kill, and how she acquired such unlimited control. Yu answered the masked man that she had been watching him for a long time. She knew that he had strength, but he did not kill Wei and the company. This word is not very applicable to the person who blew up those scum with mercury fulminate. Ji had to fight further. She continued to say, if we also take into account that little cretin who is circling around you, then the conclusion suggests itself. However, Ji angered her. The mask realized that when he saved children from bullying, he thereby provoked her. Lien asked the teacher about the task in which she was the target. The mask suggested Wu to replace the carrier. Yu was still talking monotonously about what she knew about the time limits of this task, otherwise he would have already retreated. The masked man looked at the timer where 12 hours remained, and told Ji that this lady was an extremely interesting person. She noticed that in this state, Assistant Wu would not be able to break through her toys. He asked her if she saw them only as toys, and why Pin was standing next to her. To which Yu Lien responded, out of love for Jiang, and hugged her with her arms. The masked man didn't know what to say. He was stunned by her statement. She said that she fell in love with Ping at first sight when she saved her former toy Xiao. Besides, she has a pious and proud look. Yu said that she wanted to tear off this cheerful mask from her face, and therefore she humiliated her and organized persecution. Dealing with another zombie, Ji asked her if it was she who organized the death of Xiao Ku. The masked man said, it turns out that in fact that poor girl was not afraid of Wang Wei, but of her. Smiling and touching Zhang's face, she replied that it was true. The masked man noticed that she was crazy. Lien invited Ji to kneel in front of her, and perhaps she would show him leniency. He replied that this would take her into account. Laughing loudly, she asked Assistant Wu if he really believed that he had a chance. To which he replied that you should not become arrogant ahead of time, since surprises happen at the moment when you think that you have one. At this time, the mask discovered that Chu's formation had reached 100%, but he couldn't figure out who, because everyone was here. Suddenly, a whirlwind formed around Jiang and lifted her to the heights. She turned into Chu. Ping asked her if it was true that she killed Xiao Ku. Ji smiled and said that the main character had awakened. Yu Lien was shocked by this turn of events and asked Ping how she was able to resist her hypnosis. Jiang ignored the question, claiming that she was using her, and harming so many innocent people. Lien said that she should take her side, and not be angry because of that girl. Pin shouted that she didn't deserve this and angrily rushed at her. The masked man noticed that Wu Ji was lucky. Who would have thought that the newly minted Chu would help him complete the task? Wu replied that there was no blind luck in his plans, and in fact he used a mental connection on Jiang. He asked Ping if she wanted to know the true reason behind Xiao Ku's death, and urged her to wake up by facing the truth. She did not understand what was happening, and asked him how she could find out the true cause of her death. Wu Ji cleverly calculated everything, showing her how everything really happened. While Chu in the form of Jiang was carrying Lien's toys around, the mask noticed that the skill could also be used in this way. He added that it was heartless of him to take advantage of her hatred while she turns into Chu and kills. He stands aside. Wu Ji said that he prefers to do all the work himself, and that it is not usually his style to watch something like this. He asked him if he wasn't interested in knowing what truly has more power, love or hate. Yu Lien said that this was exactly the expression she wanted to see, noting that even she was concerned by the fact that there was no genuine kindness. She urged Pin to tear off her hypocritical mask, and release the darkness lurking in her heart. Jiang swung her hand to hit Lien, when suddenly Ji grabbed her hand. He urged you not to be so naive. He asked her how she was going to distinguish evil without having kindness. He acted decisively, and hugging Pin he gently kissed her on the lips. With his kiss, she seemed to acquire pure consciousness, and gradually came to her senses. In her eyes one could no longer see monstrous and desert pupils, but beautiful human ones. It was as if she had awakened from a dream. Jiang looked into the teacher's eyes in surprise. To the side, Yu Lien screamed that this couldn't be happening, bring her back to consciousness with just a kiss. Satisfied with himself, Ji turned to her and said that he would answer her this question in the next life. He pulled out a sharpened piece of bone that he had previously used to pin his hair, and with lightning speed he threw it towards Lien, hitting her in the head. She fell lifelessly to the ground, and with her all her toys. She and Jiang stood in the schoolyard among the scattered bodies at the moment and the message about the completion of the task was displayed. He had to return to the space of murderous intentions to receive a reward. He told Pin that he had to go. Grabbing his hand, Jiang asked where he was going. At this time the teleportation had already begun. Ji replied that he was returning to where he should be. he asked if they would meet again someday. He gently took her hand. Teacher Wu added that if he were in her place, he would want this to not happen again. She was at a loss while he finally teleported to another dimension. One by one, the students seemed to begin to wake up, coming to their senses. They didn't understand what they were doing here, why they were bleeding and their whole body ached. Pin raised her head and looking at the sky, said that she did not want to part with Teacher Wu. Meanwhile, Ji found himself in the space of murderous intentions C-444. He looked around and peered at everything available in this dimension. A satisfied mask still flew around him. Ji asked him if this was their stronghold. The mask said that carriers who completed the task could get here. He added that it is necessary to wait for the decision on the award and the assignment of a new task. Smiling, Wu turned to him and asked only carriers can get into this space. At that moment, Jiang appeared in the dimension. She wandered around space, not understanding where she was and where to go to find a teacher. Shocked by this turn of events, the masked man screamed that this couldn't be happening. At this time, another mask appeared in another dimension and said that Lien agreed to become a carrier, but her failure should not happen again. Having discovered her body, he bowed before it, and apparently used superpowers. An unknown female silhouette began to crawl out of Yu Lian's body. It was as if her soul was wandering in the dark. She turned to the mask, saying that coincidences make this life interesting, especially since it would be boring without a worthy opponent. Lien's body literally turned into a monster. The surrounding students did not understand what was happening. Wings sprouted from her waist like a fly. She acquired an eerie appearance. She said that she could not help but approve of his inclinations. On the other hand, this word is hardly applicable to such a monster. Lien deliberately agreed to become a carrier so that she could meet Wu Ji again, her eyes filled with malice. She added that the scars he caused, she would fill it with blood. Bees flew around her, since her title was Queen Bee. Yu Lian still hypnotized the poor and tormented students by her. She remembered that she also needed to get to Pinner. At that moment she teleported in an unknown direction, leaving behind angry students who rushed to beat each other with particular cruelty. The masked man noticed that not only had she returned to the state of Chu, she had also entered the space of murderous intent. The mask said that it was unlikely that Jiang could be a carrier, since she was too ignorant. Pin asked him to stop, pushing him away with her hand, and explaining that she just wanted to be with Teacher Wu. He was out of his mind, and said that she was an impolite girl, and did she know who she raised her hand to? Ji turned to Pinner and asked what her parents would think when they discovered she was missing. Lowering her head, she said pitifully that she had no parents and was an orphan. He sighed sadly and looked at her just as pitifully. In response, the teacher remained silent. Jiang told how it was difficult for her to make friends, because she worked and studied since childhood. She thought that Lien was her friend. Even the man in the mask was moved and said that her story was truly regrettable, but he still tried to drive her away, saying that she must return to her world and not create trouble here. Jiang replied that she was just following Teacher Wu, and she didn't know how to get back. As Pin left, she turned around and looked at Teacher Wu, and in response he looked at her. Suddenly something flew towards Ji from the side at breakneck speed. The masked man called on Ji to calm down, saying that this is all a test. He turned and drew attention to an unusual and incomprehensible structure. Straightening his arms, he came closer to the unknown. Some kind of vein reached out to him. It approached Ji's head and seemed to enter his frontal part. It read the information and determined the degree of completion of the task, with potential A, and Ji also had 5 talent points, which he could distribute at his discretion. Suddenly he was assigned the potential of Carrier C. The masked man noted that with a C rank, he can survive visiting about 10 worlds. In addition, he had 5 attribute points, which means he was satisfied with the completion of the task. Suddenly it reached out to Jiang. The masked man was unhappy with the decision to read information about her, since in his opinion it was a waste of time. Nevertheless, a reading device in the form of a wire entered Pinner's head. Suddenly Ji threw the reading core to the other side. The masked man shouted with incredible surprise that this was an A-rank talent. At this time, in the northern European region, someone turned to everyone's father, asking this another titanic level. He told him to shut up. In ancient Egypt, Anu appeared, to whom they turned to saying that a new sun had appeared, but he was the eternal sun. Meanwhile in Japan, a store owner was sweeping the street, saying that it would not affect the excitement that the mask with horns was watching. In Great Britain, an eagle owl watched a sleeping girl. Suddenly, all the information began to rapidly mix. The masked man shouted with delight that she had rank A, and said that he would fulfill any of her wishes, and also offered to become its bearer. At this moment, Ji intervened with words about what a devotee had become, and flicked him on the forehead. Jiang looked at the teacher and asked what this a rank meant, and if she could stay with him. He thought that they would make a pretty good tandem. He grinned and said that she could just call him Wu Ji. A joyful man in a mask, calling them his carriers, said that he would find them rooms for rest. At this time, the murderous intent system signaled. The masked man noticed that they were out of luck, since a new task had already arrived. He also added that they would rest after completing the task, if, of course, they returned alive. They looked at each other. Jiang tried to address him, but he interrupted her. Having said that they will inspect their new place of residence later, the system of murderous intentions said that enough of these snot, and they will still have time to communicate. He ordered Wu Ji to follow him and the teleportation began. The teacher turned to Pinner with a request to wait for him, and finally teleported away. Sad Jiang stood there and, realizing that something might happen to him, could no longer find a place for herself. Meanwhile, having teleported to the location, Ji opened his eyes. He noticed people who were photographing him in an interesting way. Ji, looking around, noticed that he was in an incredibly beautiful and futuristic city. He looked down and discovered that a sword was sticking out of his female chest. The man in the mask noticed that in this dimension he was in the body of a very attractive girl. Ji thanked him for the compliment. Wu noticed that the transformation of energy and the arrangement of matter in this world are beyond imagination. He touched his chest. The masked man said that this is a fairly fast Chu formation of 50%, because they haven't had time to do anything yet. Those around were perplexed that she survived. The masked man said that this is the star of Reims, and she is the leading force. The news feed put Ji on the wanted list, suspecting him of committing a crime, attaching a photo, and asking him to be vigilant. The masked man suggested that the wanted girl looked like him. Ji replied that he didn't look like him, but it was definitely him. Turning around, Wu noticed that all the citizens continued to take pictures of him. Something incomprehensible began to happen. There was the sound of a siren in the area. They looked at each other, not understanding what to do. Suddenly, rectangular red shapes rose from the ground and surrounded Ji with the mask. It turned out it was the teleportation of robotic employees by the law. They quickly headed towards Wu Ji. He looked around and thought about further actions. Without much ceremony with them, and jumping towards them, he struck first. Literally with one rather sharp wave of his hand, he cut off their heads. But after a few seconds they regenerated back, and unharmed they stood in front of Ji. He did not expect such a turn, and asked the masked man if this was the dominant of pure energy. He replied that he hoped Ji would survive until he met his partner. Dodging their blasters, he asked the masked man about his partner. The same one was surprised that Ji had not read his assignment. One of the laser shots hit an innocent civilian. Ji continued to fight with the robots. The masked man remembered that he never showed him his task. The mask immediately gave him all the necessary information on the assignment, where it was said that he would have a partner with him. However, while Ji was reading information about the task, one of the opponents struck him, from which he subsequently flew several meters to the side. The masked man noticed that with such a reaction Ji would not succeed. He had the idea to use the second skill, namely the boundless ocean of knowledge. Ji flew up and sequentially read information from the robots. They stared at him in surprise, with their only eye, burning like a blue tribe. You realized that this ability does not work on them, and assumed that it only works on matter, but not on energy. All the robots pointed their blasters in his direction. Ji thought and tried to find a way to destroy these clots of energy. But there was a catastrophic lack of time, as the robots launched a cannonade from their guns. Ji sharply reached for his sword, and taking it out of its sheath, the idea came to him to cut them with laser beams. That's what happened. He successfully divided one of the rays directed at him into two parts. The mask noticed that this was a good idea. Finally cutting the laser, Ji got closer and thrust the sword into the robot's eye. The robot seemed to be locked up from the inside. His head was bursting at the seams. Finally he collapsed to the ground, and Yu, pleased with himself, said that he understood how to use the sword against them. Inspired and full of confidence, Ji flew to the others in order to deal with them too. One by one, the hacked robots fell, filling the space. Without the slightest opportunity to continue the confrontation, they tried to do it anyway. Focused, Ji gradually made his way through the crowd of robots. Finally suppressing their aggression completely, he exhaled and sheathed his sword. The man in the mask noticed that even robots could not stop him. You assumed that stronger rivals would now follow him. Ji said that they shouldn't get into trouble until they finally figure out the situation, and only he remembered his partner. Suddenly, a certain beam pierced the earth from the sky. With a shock wave it threw away the remains of robots. It turned out that it was his partner who arrived to help, from System C-5214. The mask noted that he had not seen another system for a long time, while Ji could not understand why the robots acquired a material form. He shook himself off and tried his best to impress Ji, since he was in the body of a beautiful girl. The partner introduced himself as Li Feihong. He was a Confucian. He greeted Ji, who was reading information about him. The gathering of the blue team was completed. The mask noticed that he was indeed a Confucian. Wu asked him how many titles there were. The masked man chose to slyly evade the answer, hinting that Ji should ask him nicely. Another man in a mask readily answered that there are 12 types in total. Mask Ji was dissatisfied with this behavior from Mask Li, as he demonstrated with his facial expression. Wu said that he should change the system. Mask Ji reminded him that he was not the one who spoke about changing the feeder, and that this is the height of indecency. Feihong Mask asked Ji what his rank was, to which he replied that it was a secret. Mask Li asked to respond to kindness with kindness. Besides, having learned each other's abilities, there is a greater chance of mutual understanding. Hinting that she is a girl who should yield to a man, Mask Ji said that he is a man in a girl's body. Feihong and his mask were shocked. They did not know how to respond to this. In surprise, Li froze in place with his mouth open, and called Ji buddy. He was clearly nervous, and muttered something incomprehensible under his breath, hiding behind a strange fan. Suddenly, Ji saw several flying machines approaching them and suggested running as fast as possible. At this moment, Li also paid attention to them. They hovered in the sky. He stood and watched as their guns turned in his direction. Feihong said that a true noble husband should protect beauties, and at the moment correcting himself, said that he meant a friend. Li noticed that there were more and more of them. They were flying up in large numbers. He reiterated that a true noble man should not shy away from a challenge. Suddenly, very large objects began to generate in front of him. They carried out their full generation, and he realized that huge robots. Correcting himself a little, he said that a real noble man should listen to the opinions of others. Turning around, he found that Ji had already run away. Li tried to call him. Having caught up with him, he asked why he didn't invite him with him, and asked what they should do next. Does this mean that everything was the memory of the previous owner? Ji called on Feihong to follow him. Under fire they ran away together away from this army. Meanwhile, Xiao Nian and Xiao Hua wandered along the same type of corridors. Suddenly they were surrounded by a group of unknown people. Hua said that she found the blue group. They were placed in a room. Xiao Hua felt a little bad. Nian said that she would do everything herself. The gathering of the red team was completed. Meanwhile, being in this beautiful and high tower, in the room, the door opened, and the guard standing on the threshold asked them to follow him. Leaving the room, he turned to them, saying that they were lucky. They had just arrived when the boss was ready to receive them. They followed the guard up the long steps. Opening the door slightly, he told the boss that he had brought someone. Nian and Hua remained on the sidelines. Going inside, they literally stumbled upon some kind of bacchanalia, where a satisfied boss was sitting on a chair. He looked at them cynically, and with excessive pathos and impudence called on them to come closer. Everyone around them was in strange outfits. They looked at them and smiled. Finally, Hua and Nian approached the boss. He was smoking a cigar and peering at them. At one point he said that he was pleased with the quality of the goods, and reached out with his hand to Nian. He took her in his hand and wanted to bring her closer. She didn't even think of resisting. On the contrary, she noticed that she was extremely lucky in this task. Since her first ability was to comprehend anger, which gave her incredible strength. He smiled and said that he liked such lively girls, after which something incomprehensible and inexplicable began to happen. Suddenly she realized what was happening, but she was still surprised. Nian couldn't believe what was happening. He activated teleportation. Hua tried to call out to her. At this time, Xiao Hua was grabbed by the guards. Nian did not know what to do. She kept repeating that this cannot be. Is he really the perfect carrier? The others, led by the boss, stood and watched as Hua and Nian flew up into the dome. Nian went through the options. He assumed that he had exchanged energy units. Life forms in the electronic world are in an energetic state, they are able to create energy of their own type. These are the methods of Capita, who was the tycoon of the computer network of this world. In this way he seized control over everyone. Thus, society, depending on the preferences and sympathies of Capita, was divided into several classes. Ordinary citizens capable of using 30 units of energy daily. Fighters and officials, who are also capable of using more than 100 units of energy daily, and sometimes about 1,000 units of energy. Finally, high-level officials and Capit's confidants, capable of using more than 1,000 units of energy. Despite the fact that people have the opportunity to accumulate more energy to move up the ladder, few people can do this. Still smoking a cigar, the boss ordered to take weapons and grab these girls. Nien understood that it was simply impossible to fight openly with Capit, with their 30 units of energy. The only opportunity was to use the abilities of knowledge that the system of murderous intentions endowed them with. True, their skills are limited by their mental state, and Nien's limit was about 2 minutes, she still used the second skill. The main advantage of this ability was that the activated shield reflected enemy attacks. Nien continued to think, despite the fact that this world consists of energy life forms, the power of bullets remains normal. She wanted to determine if her skills could cause significant damage to them. Nien scattered the boss's guards, but little was done to harm him. He noticed that she was doing a good job, but it was all in vain because he had a much larger reserve of energy compared to them. Taking the 6-barreled minigun in his hands and opening fire from it, he wanted to demonstrate this difference. Nien answered, because he still did not understand that her abilities do not depend on his energy, and that in general there are different things. Meanwhile, she used the first ability, which was the comprehension of anger. The boss was really nervous, since this was not an exchange for energy units, and he did not fully understand what he was dealing with. In turn, Xiao Nian understood that this was perhaps her only chance. At this moment, he frantically tried to activate spatial transfer. The boss realized that something was wrong with her, which he wanted to urgently inform Capit about. Suddenly something went wrong and the transfer was blocked. He did not understand what was happening. A huge hand appeared in front of him, holding something incomprehensible but very large. He finally realized that this was his end, which he could not prevent in any way. As a result, this something fell upon him with crushing force. Everything happened at lightning speed. He didn't even have time to blink an eye before he was already gone. All that was left of him was his pretentious cap, which flew to the side. Xiao Nian stood up and said that her ability was still able to inflict impressive damage on them. Suddenly she felt weak. Xiao Hua rushed to her aid. Nian understood that if she now met with the goal of the task, she would have no chance. In addition, there were obstacles in the form of rivals. At this time, the wall behind them collapsed, from which human silhouettes could be seen. It was Ji and Fei Hong. They broke through the wall and flew inside. Upon landing, Li asked Wu why it was necessary to break the wall, because they should have just run away. Ignoring his next bad joke, Ji turned his attention to the girls. He thought that in this place, only Zhao Jiangxuan should be able to use more than 1,000 points of energy. But judging by the traces at the scene, there were 2 groups of people capable of this. Nian asked if these were their competitors. Nian Mask noted that it is better not to mess with them now, because she cannot yet use the abilities. Hua quickly realized that if they attacked, she would be left alone. Ji realized that they were their rivals for the task, and that they were only after the battle. Yu suggested that there was no better time to find while they were vulnerable. The mask noticed that this was cruel on his part, but supported his decision. Suddenly, behind them was an army of robots from which they were trying to hide. Ji and Fei Hong turned around and raised their hands up. Wu understood how to beat the current situation. He said that he found Zhao who was carrying out human trafficking on the dark net, and was eliminated by him because he resisted. He also noticed that they could check his residual data as proof. The robot replied that the report had been received, after which he began stabilizing his residual data. Li asked him how he managed to pull this off. He replied that they considered him a traitor because he worked undercover. Then Fei Hong asked him how he knew that they were here. Ji replied that most likely it was because of the memories of the previous owner. Xiao Nian and Xiao Hua hurried to leave the scene. At that moment, an unknown person flew up to Ji and Li in a flying chair, saying that they made so much noise. And he arrogantly added that such a large fish fell into their hands. One of the robots addressed him with a report, calling him Mr. Capit. Li and Nian with Hua were dumbfounded. as they realized that this was their goal of the task. Capet slowly and naturally descended from the chair to the ground and approached Ji. He told him, if there is irrefutable evidence against Zhang Jianxuan, then he will become the hero of this city. But due to the fact that there was a lot to check, Capet asked to accompany Ji to assist in the investigation. The robot accepted the order. Capet smiled and told Wu that he would have to wait a while with honors. Ji played along with him and said that responsibilities come first. Ji introduced Li to Capita, and said that he recruited Fei Hong as an informant, and therefore his data is not in the registry. Capet ordered the security robots to take everyone to the police station and take them under protection. Nian and Hua were the victims. Capet understood that something was wrong here, because before his death Zhao sent an interrupted message. He decided to take control of them in order to figure out what was going on. Ji sat in a cell with bright lamps that he looked at. Because there was nothing to do, and all that was left was to wait. He understood something was wrong here, because no one had yet come to him to question him. Suddenly the door opened and Fei Hong rushed into his room. Ji asked him what happened. He replied that they were set up by those two brats, and now they have big problems. Capet quickly walked along the corridor, to the cell where Ji was with Fei Hong. Going inside with Hua and Nian, he said that the girls told him how they and Zhao were together, and now they are awaiting re-education. Ji was shocked by this statement from Capet. He performed a scan, during which it turned out that Hua and Nian each had 5,000 energy points. The masked man noticed that they were cleverly deceived by their competitors. Ji and Fei Hong were led in handcuffs to a bus that would take them far from paradise. Li asked him if he had any workable plan. Ji replied that in 3 seconds they will try to break through to 9 o'clock. Fei Hong happily agreed, and was already looking forward to the moment. They simultaneously and with lightning speed broke the chains on the handcuffs, and they rushed as fast as they could for 9 o'clock, trying to hide from the guards. The guards raised the alarm, shouting that they must stop them. Running away from the guards, they saw ahead a raid from the guards, and an unknown girl. They thought they had fallen into a trap, but at that moment Ji recognized her. Li flashed a metaphor, saying that they were right between a rock and a hard place. Ji tried to understand what she was doing here. Fei Hong used his ability and was about to rush into a fight. How suddenly the system said that it was Jiang. He did not understand how she got out of the space of murderous intentions. Wu was surprised, and stopped Li Fei Hong, who was already ready to attack them. Guards surrounded them on all sides, ordering them not to make any sudden movements. Li asked Ji why he stopped him. At that moment Pin came up and said that she would figure it out herself and they could go. One of the guards said that they were too strong, and urged her to be careful, since safety comes first. She asked him if he meant to say that his and the others' fighting ability was higher than hers. He replied that he didn't think so. She abruptly and rudely ordered the guards to get out of here. In response they obeyed her. Fei Hong looked after the leaving guards, and assumed that it would not be so easy to deal with her, since she sent them back. He kept telling Ji to be careful with her. How at that moment she rushed into the arms of Ji, recognizing him as Teacher Wu. Li was horrified. Wu Ji asked her how she recognized him. She said that she saw a system of murderous intentions, and asked him why in the body of a girl. She said that as soon as she saw him, she immediately felt that it was him. Assuming that perhaps this was some kind of kinship of their souls, she was sincerely glad to see him. Suddenly an angry man in a mask intervened, who asked her how she ended up here, and he didn't believe in any kind of kinship of souls. Jiang Pinger thought about it and didn't know how to answer this question. The only thing Jiang could say was that she herself did not fully understand how it happened. Ji asked the system if he was sure that it was Pinger. He replied that it was her, and he himself was shocked, adding that people without a superego are a mystery. Fei Hong and Jiang met and were nice to each other, while Ji tried to understand what her secret was. She turned to the teacher, and, calling out to him, came closer. Pin said that they didn't have much time, so she asked directly if the task was somehow connected with Capet. Ji said that he was also interested in something. Fei Hong noticed how quickly they got into the role. Capet was watching them. He saw how Pin forced them into the car at gunpoint, staging an arrest. In Capet's office, Nian asked him if it was worth letting them go so easily. He replied that every person should be given a chance to correct their mistakes, and that is why DreamWorks exists. Nian said that they were dangerous. She understood that it would no longer be possible to destroy competitors with the hands of Capet. In response, Capet told her to begin her duties, since she agreed to replace Zhao, and she should prove that she is worthy. Seeing that Nian would not calm down, Hua said that she would not let Capit down, and tried to calm down Xiao Nian. She said if Capit no longer has anything to do with them, then they will go and begin their immediate duties. They left his office, but it was clear from Nian that she could not accept the fact that their idea had failed. They looked at each other. Hua showed with all her appearance and with her actions that she needed to calm down. They moved to the side where no one was, and launched a command communication channel. Team mode allowed team members to communicate without fear of being listened to. Nian could not calm down, and again repeated that it would be an ideal option, to remove the competitors with his hands. Hua noticed that the amount of energy collected would still not be enough to cope with Capit. Nian resolutely said that in this case they have only one way left. She suggested using Hua's ability to turn everyone into Chu monsters, who would themselves deal with Capit. Her ability is animism, which makes it possible to perceive and influence the life state of the target. Hua approached the guard to read his information, where Chu's formation was indicated at 50%. Meanwhile, the sun slowly went behind the ghostly horizon. Ji and Li were on the bus with the rest of the prisoners, who were outraged by Capit's similar rule. At this time, Li pestered Ji with questions. He wanted to know why she gave Wu 5,000 energy. Did she have a boyfriend? There were many questions. Ji said that he did not know the answers to these questions, and urged them to think about the task. He asked what they knew at the moment. Li said that everything here is ruled by the energy that is in Capit. He also has the power. Their competitors are children whose skills are unknown to them. Ji agreed and came to the conclusion that Capit cannot be defeated in this world with the usual methods. Li said that there are abilities of ranks for this. Ji replied that his skills are for the material world, and Li's skills are limited in time. Li noted that if you hit it with full force, it will last for about a minute. If you activate it for a long time, then you get a headache. Ji asked if he could capture Capit in this minute. He replied that if you find weak points, then anything can happen. Wu said that one cannot go far with one's abilities, and they have only one way. Fei Hong asked him if he was joking. Extremely surprised, Li began to understand what Ji was talking about. Wu said that it was necessary to take away the supreme power in the use of energy from Capit. Fei Hong noticed that Capit divided the loophole in the right of control between 4 subordinates. Li asked Ji how they were going to find them. He replied that he had some ideas in this regard. Wu said that the first thing you need to do is try your luck in finding one of the 4 loopholes in this Dreamworks, where Mr. Y is in charge. Everyone was taken off the bus where they were greeted by Mr. E, calling them his new fans. He said that they would soon become new members of his big family. Fei Hong asked Wu Ji how he was going to look for the so-called loophole in the huge amusement park. Without waiting for an answer, he said that it was necessary to grab someone and question him properly. They heard calls for all new arrivals to take part in a welcome meeting with Mr. Y. Li noted that it's too easy, you don't even need a plan. They approached 2 girls, and Ji asked for 2 seats. In response they were greeted as new fans, saying that they were one family. Fei Hong asked Ji to think it over again, and wanted to look for another option. Arguing that he does not want to become some kind of fan. He saw how one of the arrivals was subdued and dragged inside. At the same time the girl standing at the entrance called to go to their house. Realizing that Ji was already inside, he decided to follow him, carefully looking at the guards along the way. Fei Hong, pretending to be a fool, clarified how to get to the place for raising fans, and went inside. He saw Ji sitting on a chair, and sat down next to him and convincingly asked about the plan for their further actions. Li asked not to hide from him what Ji had planned. He in turn replied that after seeing Fei Hong's abilities, one idea came to him. But first, he wanted to see what tricks they had prepared for them. Li said with concern that his words did not instill confidence in him. This place resembled a theater. In front of them there was a stage from which unknown smoke came. A cheerful girl was dancing on stage and shouting that Mr. and everything is for them. Suddenly Ji felt that something strange was happening to the chair. At the same moment, the straps flew out of the chair, securing him in the chair as much as possible. A moment later they were all electrocuted. There was a wild cry. They asked to let them go. The girl on stage continued to dance just as cheerfully and naturally. Ji didn't know what to do. He thought that he would never get out of this chair. On the stage they again showed a portrait of Mr. I, and the girls still shouted in the dance that he was their savior. Wu Ji realized that this was all Milgram's experiment of submission. and that he uses this method to control the fans and turn them into his power. This experiment serves as a test of the forces of resistance to the orders of a superior, which go against the conscience of the subjects. Some were already in tears. At that moment Ji still managed to get out by cutting the belts with a sword. Ji realized that it was an intoxicating gas, but since he went through the career of an agent, he developed resistance to suggestion. Untangling himself from the arms of the chair, Ji asked Fei Hong to wait for him, while the others gradually succumbed to hypnosis. Li at this time tried to get out with the help of his abilities, but his attempts were in vain. Ji noticed that his resistance could be easily exploited by Mr. E. He didn't know what to expect next from Li, and whether he would remain his partner. Having quickly generated a tranquilizer, Ji wanted to inject it into Fei Hong. But Mr. E, who appeared in front of him, said that this would not help, since Li had already become part of his family. Fei Hong was still able to extricate himself. With an enraged look and crazed eyes, he stood like a zombie. Ji threw a sword at Mr. Yi's head, and tried to wake up Li, saying that the enemy was behind him. The masked man noticed that his partner had turned into a rival. Ji said that he needed to learn something from him. Suddenly, Fei Hong, still with the same zombie eyes, angrily rushed at Ji. Masked Ji said that Li fell into the abyss of his own memories, and it seems that he considers Wu Ji his enemy. Fei Hong and Wu ran towards each other with unprecedented speed. In a tough collision, having delivered the strongest blows, Li still did not awaken from hypnosis, after which they landed on the ground, ending up in opposite directions. Ji understood that physically Li was similar to Chu, and the only option was a strong weapon that could be exchanged for energy. Considering that he recently eliminated Mr. Y with ease, perhaps things won't be that difficult. Suddenly Mr. E appeared and said that he really eliminated him. You realized that he could possess others. At this moment, the guard stabbed Mr. E in the back, who continued to speak. The guard turned to E, who smiled impudently at Ji, hinting that he would not be defeated. Wu said that he had a strange ability. Mask Li noticed that his spiritual shell had moved into another person. Mr. said that he should prepare to become part of his family. At this time Fei Hong attacked Ji, and with the most powerful blow he struck him, throwing him into the heights. The frantic Fei Hong followed him further. Ji had a little time to think. Apparently Li could not be awakened so easily from the hypnosis that was already close to him. He hit Ji again, who, writhing in pain, understood that this could all end like this. Punched into the ground, Wu tried to get up when Fei Hong walked towards him again. His anger did not subside even for a second. The hypnosis was powerful. They ran up with Mr. E to the exhausted Ji, and looked at him arrogantly. Then he leaned towards him and extended his hand, welcoming him into his family. He grabbed him by the hand and pulled him towards him, thinking that he had won this fight. Suddenly Ji grabbed him back and looked into his eyes with a grin, and began to realize that he was up to something. While Ji held his hand, he called on Li to wake up and start acting, and did not understand how he woke up. All this time, the truth was right under Mr. E's nose, which he never saw. Fei Hong shouted that he had forced the noble man to harm his comrade, and used the second skill of the Golden Palaces. And he stated that if they kill him, he will simply pass on to another family member, and thereby be reborn again. Towering over him, Ji replied that no one was going to kill him, and he began to use the student's first ability, a boundless ocean of knowledge, which he combined with Fei Hong's skill. Mr. E was at a loss from such extraordinary power, and did not know how to stop them. He asked them who they really were. Coming closer to him, Ji replied in a sarcastic manner that they were ordinary passers-by. Wu also combined mental connection with skills, and urged him to discover the secret of Capita's loophole. Sitting on the ship he and Li had built from their skills, Ji wandered through Mr. Yi's memories. He saw how and, as a boy, linked his fate with Capit, which subsequently changed his appearance beyond recognition. Ji noticed that this was Mr. Li's origin, but there was no loophole. He carefully searched further, and yet after a while he found this loophole. The original loophole was his eye implants. He saw Capit give them to him. Suddenly Fei Hong interrupted Ji's search and thoughts and called him. Wu came down. Li couldn't stand it and asked him if he had found a loophole. Satisfied Ji, showing Mr. Yi's eye implant, said that this is a loophole. Fei Hong and the masks literally rejoiced at this news. At that moment Yi called out to Wu. He asked, the force with which he invaded his mind was not from this world, and their essence was also not from here. They didn't understand how he found out. and he said that during the control he managed to see some memories. Noticing that there is still a world in which the material form dominates, Ji asked what this gives him. Wu said that a dead person is unlikely to be able to reveal their secret to anyone, and confidently stated that he would not be able to kill him. Having added that he would forever remain near Mr. Capet, strange smoke came out of his mouth. Fei Hong screamed, not understanding what he had done to him. Ji replied that his energy was disappearing and it looked like a way of self-destruction. Enveloped in a flame of energy, Mr. E said that by taking away the control loophole, they had completed one very important task, and that all their efforts turned him into Mr. Li, which is pure and eternal energy for Mr. Capet. They watched as his body burned out in the thick of energy. Li didn't understand what his words meant, because they won, but there was a feeling as if this was not the end. Ji urged Li to hurry up, since most likely Capet already knew everything, especially since they needed to master one more energy point. Meanwhile, in Capet's office, in which Jiang was also present, he watched closely what was happening on the big screen. Suddenly he grabbed his head and gritted his teeth rather nervously. Pin asked him if he was okay. He waved his hand and signaled that everything was fine. He sat down in a chair and turned to her, and said that Mr. Li's loophole was already in their hands. Jiang began to play along with Capet, shouting indignantly about how they could find out about the loopholes, but inside she was jubilant. She couldn't understand how Capet knew about what happened to Mr. Li, because he didn't leave his office, and for some reason he was happy about it. He said that she doubted seeing him smile, knowing that his loophole was stolen. Capet showed Jiang the video that Mr. Li sent him before his death, and asked her to take a look. She asked if it was all energy. The video showed the use of the joint skills of Ji and Li. Capet replied that this does not apply to the energy of their world. She was surprised. Capet said that he looked at the records of their energy transaction fluctuations, but could not see the energy crossover. Moreover, Capet noticed that the case of Zhao Meili and Zhao Jiangsu sent someone to kill him, and the other guy was also accidentally killed. Ping asked him if he believed that they rose from the dead to take over the loopholes. She said that Yuchen would protect the loopholes. Capet said that this was not necessary, since they were a gift for their heaven, and an ideal addition to the plan of eternal life. Pin didn't quite understand what she was talking about. Capet realized that she didn't know about it, and snapped his fingers. At that moment, a hologram of the planet appeared, and he said that the planet consists of energy that began to age. He created a system of energy value so that everyone would live a long time, and changes in mood generate energy, which supplies the planet. He also noticed that people's emotions are quite unstable, and therefore it was more difficult to influence them. Therefore, he trained Ping, Yi, Zhao and Kurtz, who were to stimulate the people to distribute energy values. In recent years, stimulation has become useless. Pin proposed giving power to people. Capet said that she was young and did not understand. But with the appearance of this guy, the situation changed, and perhaps Capet found a new generator to supply the planet. He replied that she was glad to serve him, but she understood that she needed to quickly tell the teacher everything before they were caught. She asked if they needed to be arrested. He replied that there was no need for that. She suggested that she would do everything. Suddenly, an unknown robot monster broke through the wall behind them. No one understood where he came from or what he wanted. The guards opened fire on him, which was not very successful, since everything happened exactly the other way around. The robot shot all the guards, behind whom stood Nian, who said that Capet could not hide now, even though she had to combine their skills with Hua. Jiang didn't know what to do in this situation, protect Capet and not reveal her identity, or run away. She said that Capet's safety comes first and she should retreat. He urged her to be more calm-blooded, saying that some insect could not scare a lion. Capet approached the robot and, not allowing it to attack first, activated the barrier. The robot monster suddenly found himself trapped in a cage. Capet stood and looked at him, as he immediately ordered the destruction of the robot. The edges of the cell sharply converged, thereby sawing the monster into small pieces. On the one hand, Hua and Nian, who stood in bewilderment, did not understand how this happened. On the other, Jiang, who was no less surprised. Capet stood proudly and quite confidently in front of the remains of the robot. He said that everyone had probably forgotten that it was he who ruled this world. He turned to Pin and said that Kurtz would deliver those two girls here, but before that, the surrounding area needed to be cleared. Jiang was surprised that Kurz had already left. She asked Capet how exactly it was necessary to clear the surroundings. He stated that these are not the only foreigners, although they are small, but isn't it annoying when they constantly jump in front of you? Pin understood that he wanted to study all the data for deviation, and in this case she would be discovered. She realized that she could not help you. Meanwhile, Ji and Fei Hong wandered through the park among the hypnotized zombies. Li asked him if they would remove the hypnosis. Wu Ji replied that this was a particularly valuable combat power. Fei Hong said that he would not act like Mr. E. Wu said that after taking control of energy, he had to understand that competition lies in the amount of energy. Ji said that the energy that Capita shows for everyone to see is not the only one, and if this is not done, they will be the losers. At that moment Fei Hong snatched the loophole from Ji's hands. And he said that the rule of a good guy is not to take advantage of innocent people. Wu demanded that the loophole be returned. Ji strongly recommended giving him the loophole and discussing everything calmly. In this way they would complete the mission and maintain friendship. At that moment, an unknown guy appeared in the car that the zombies were carrying in their arms. He noticed that they had not reached a general consensus. He added that their use will directly depend on his help. An unknown person ordered the hypnotized zombies to kill Ji and Fei Hong. Scattering one after another, Ji said that this is not the time to show his character. Being also in a fight, Li replied that a truly good guy would never take the side of evil. Wu argued that the main thing is to use energy rationally. Li said that this is not an excuse. The villain noticed that he was on time. Ji could not come to an agreement with Fei Hong. He urged him to calm down and stop being angry. Li, as before, stood his ground. At that moment he began to use standing abilities. As he scattered the zombies, he continued to tell Ji that exploiting people for his own purposes is not considered a fair victory. At that moment, Fei Hong flew into the main villain, dealing him a crushing blow. Not expecting such force, the unknown guy flew out of the back of the car. Fei Hong ran up to him and delivered several more equally weak blows. Li literally drove him into the sign of the amusement park. In turn, the unknown person could not do anything. Once on the ground, the villain finally realized that he could not hide. Fei Hong felt his advantage and attacked him again. Inflicting several more powerful attacks, he jumped to the side. Finding himself in front of Ji, Fei Hong, pleased with himself, approached him. He said that this is the determination of a good guy. Ji grinned in response. Suddenly they heard a grunt to the side. Ji and Fei Hong turned around. It was an unknown guy who had been driven into the ground. The villain counted the damage out loud. He said that their strength was different from theirs, and for this reason Capita noticed them. Li said that they didn't touch his brain, otherwise there's no way to explain why he was so stupid. Tip added that because Fei Hong caused him such pain, he will reward him. Suddenly he tore his shirt and pressed something on his chest, where he had a computer in the form of a screen. Ji turned back, where he saw the jammed zombies muttering something under their breath. At that moment, they all received a message that their salaries had been reduced by 50%. It was as if they were being shocked, and still jammed, they fell to the ground. They were dumbfounded. Li asked what happened. Ji didn't know what to answer. An unknown guy came out from the side, unharmed, and, calling himself Kurtz, introduced himself as the president of a huge company. Languidly and grinning, he added that the next round was clearly his. He was literally floating in the air when he suddenly ordered the zombies to capture Ji and Fei Hong in 5 minutes. They received a message that contained a performance appraisal, which stated that it was necessary to catch the target in 5 minutes. They mercilessly rushed at Ji and Fei Hong, who did not understand anything. Li called on one of the zombie attackers, Kurtz, to come to his senses. In response, the hypnotized said that he was talking nonsense, and no one controls them. Fei Hong asked them, if they are not under control, then why are they helping Kurtzu? One of them explained that they had families and they needed to feed them, and besides, the last attempt to disobey had already led to trouble. The other, on the contrary, loudly ordered them to shut up immediately. Fei Hong thought that everyone wants to become a hero, but life can be quite unpredictable. Having thought about the problem more globally, he realized for himself that a person should not be like that. Suddenly his thought process was interrupted by Ji, who hit him on the head with the hilt of his sword. Then he leaned towards him and confidently said that he had a choice. While holding off the zombies, Li asked Wu if they could eventually help them. He replied that only they can help themselves, and Ji and Li can create such a chance for them. Fei Hong remained silent in response, and closing his eyes began activating the ability. Having finally activated the skill, he scattered everyone around, including Ji. Li looked at him, and after a few seconds handed him the loophole. Fei Hong exhaled and convincingly asked him to do everything he said. Ji looked at the loophole in his hand, and realized that this was their chance. Kurz interrupted them, asking if they needed a reward. In response, Ji asked him to find them a job in his huge company. Kurt said that giving up was the right decision, and he always welcomes new employees. People suddenly appeared behind Ji. He said that he was ready to accept the role of president. Kurtz approved of his choice, and noted that he wondered how much luck they would have to survive. Ji replied that he had always been quite successful. Kurz interrupted him and said that his luck ended there. A real bloodbath began between the parties. Ji and Fei Hong were about to pounce on Kurz, when suddenly, something strange appeared, similar to a floating matrix of numbers. Kurtz realized that their strength is really great, since Capit is conducting data analysis. Since he himself wanted to get rid of Capit, Kurtz decided to make them an offer. Meanwhile, in the office of Capit, who is in company with Jiang, Pin asked him for forgiveness, realizing that this was most likely the end. He replied that he could check her too, because the way she behaves can be different from what's in her head. She agreed, standing behind him and holding a gun behind her back. Jiang thought that she could now solve the teacher's problems. Capit took in his hand one of the chains flying in the space of matrices, and said that he found something. Suddenly Pin finally made up her mind and aimed the pistol at his back. At this time, the door to the office opened, on the threshold of which Nian and Hua stood, saying that no one could know about such power. Jiang exhaled because she realized that she had not been discovered, which she, in turn, was very grateful for. Capit suggested that she kill these girls in exchange for his forgiveness. She thanked him for the opportunity to atone for her guilt. In fact, she did not want and could not kill them, since they are people, and also children. He turned around and, leaving, said that he was leaving these brats to her. Capit sat down on a chair behind Pinner and said that he wanted to watch this performance. Seeing that she began to aim at them, he noticed that Jiang did not restrain himself in his desires. She told Xiao Nian and Hua that she would not spare them under any circumstances. They looked at her and noticed that she was smiling strangely. Nian and Hua looked at each other, thinking that she didn't look threatening enough. Urging Hua to be careful, Nian said that she would attack her first. At this point, Hua began to distract Jiang, allegedly begging for mercy. While Xiao Nian attacked her from the other side, she tripped Jiang, thereby knocking her to the ground. After which, using the ability, she rushed towards her again. Suddenly Pin counterattacked with a strong kick to her head. Jiang was surprised because she noticed that the body itself reacted. It was a defensive reaction to external threats to life. He thought that the owner of the body was killing people. Pinner reached for the sword that was behind her. Then she hit Nian with it, who in turn managed to activate the shield. She thought that Jiang had played a prank on her. At this moment, Xiao Nian used another of her abilities, which Pin confidently and quite successfully restrained with her sword. Capit, who was watching what was happening, understood that only those who had mastered all 4 energy points could resist so much. This group of people will really be able to improve and complete the longevity plan, Capit thought. Jiang realized that this person also mastered the ability to distort space, and her skills are in a losing situation here. Xiao Nian and Hua wanted to use the elder brother skill, activating which they would turn Jiang into Chu in order to kill Capit. Hua agreed and proceeded to activate the first ability. Pinner didn't know what to expect from them, but she understood that they couldn't plan anything good. On the illuminated panel in front of Hua, the name Jiang Pinger appeared. After several operations, the download for activation began. Jiang decided to be proactive, and took out her sword and rushed in their direction. She swung her sword at the moment when Xiao Hua activated the skill. Suddenly Pin stopped in place and looked at them in surprise. Nian and Hua also froze, waiting for the ability to activate. They were all perplexed because nothing happened. Even Capit, who was watching them, was discouraged, because he saw from the faces of Nian and Hua that something had gone wrong. Xiao Hua said that this cannot be, since she set everything up correctly. Nian was confused. She began to understand that Jiang might also be a foreigner, but their Yang system did not mention her. Capit ordered Jiang to kill the useless one and leave the second one alive, indicating that among them only one was strong. Pinner agreed to carry out his will, but she herself wanted them to use at least some plan of attack. Hua said that she was not useless, Xiao Nian tried to calm her down. At this moment, Jiang swung her sword towards Hua, and thought that she might miss on purpose. After a few seconds, she struck with her sword, closing her eyes as she did so. Reacting in time, Nian managed to activate the shield around them. But Ping was still able to injure her. Xiao Hua saw blood splatter. Suddenly Hua literally ignited with energy as it turned out that she was also injured. The dissatisfied Capet, raising his tone, repeated the order once again to Jiang. Pin apologized to him, but she herself couldn't stand it anymore, and wanted the teacher to come. She swung her sword again, and closing her eyes, she kept repeating to herself, "Teacher." At that moment, she heard a familiar voice that said that she was taking too long to carry out the order, and it wasn't like her. Kurtz, who went inside, in company with Ji and Fei Hong, who were handcuffed, said that he had brought those whom Mr. Capet wanted to see. Everyone was surprised by the fact that he caught them. Pin wanted to rush at Kurtz, but I stumbled over the teacher's calm and cool gaze. Jiang realized that it was unlikely that he would allow himself to be caught so easily, and perhaps he had a plan. Ji and Fei Hong approached Capet. Pin wanted to understand what the teacher was up to. A little earlier, namely at the time of Kurtz's agreement with Ji and Li Fei Hong, Kurtz urged Wu and Li to calm down, breathe out and sit down to talk. Fei Hong refused any talk, while Ji asked Kurtz to continue talking. He thought that they were regular enemies. Capet used the rights and took possession of the energy point, but this did not happen after the distribution of rights. Wu Ji and Li Fei Hong finally began to understand what Kurtz was driving at. He offered to unite against Capet, and gave them his loophole, in the form of a computer that he removed from his chest. Fei Hong snatched the loophole from his hands, and Ji asked what was required of them. Kurtz replied that they should help him take control of Capet. Fei Hong asked him how he was going to confront Capet without his loophole. Kurtz assured them that there would be no need to fight with him, since he learned one of his secrets when transferring the loophole. He added, grinning, that all they had to do was take possession of this secret and victory would be in their pocket. Ji replied, if it's all true what he said, then they essentially don't need to do anything. Kurtz said that this is not so at all, and he still needs their help. He added that he needed help within 30 seconds. Since this time is enough for him to finally subjugate Capet, after which they agreed to help him, because their goal was Capet. Kurtz brought him Li and Ji. He sat in his chair, looking at them arrogantly, and thanking Kurtz for the work done. Kurtz said that a hunter only needs a pistol to catch prey. Capet noted that he was one of the few who did not upset him. Nian and Hua were in thought, because if they caught such strong opponents, then it seems that they will not be able to complete the task. Ji and Fei Hong stood in front of Capet, while Kurtz held an unknown luminous thing behind his back. Nian and Hua understood everything. Kurtz grinningly answered Capet that he really always worked conscientiously. At this moment, Ji activated his ability, and Li attacked Capet. Tied up and held by Fei Hong Capet, he said that Kurtz had betrayed him. He replied that Capet himself gave him the weapon, and therefore he should not be accused of treason, adding that he is just using his chance, and in 30 seconds all energy points will come under his control. Taking advantage of the loophole, Kurtz seemed to take out Capet's soul. Li noticed that this time should be enough. Jiang realized that Kurtz would take the energy for himself, and the teacher would complete his task. How urged Xiao Nian to retreat from the task. Nian replied that she would never back down. Hua looked sadly into her eyes. Pinna realized that victory was already close, but could not understand why the teacher was too serious. Kurtz continued to tell Capet that he noticed the upper limit of the energy value at the time of transfer of rights. Capet gave away the loopholes because he himself could not control such an amount of energy, and Kurtz was not surprised that he got exploitation. He added that he was secretly collecting energy that would soon exceed his upper limits. Ji and Li noticed that he was not resisting. They found this rather strange, while Kurtz urged Capet to give all his energy. At that moment, Nian activated her ability and rushed at Capet. Jiang turned around and looked at the sad Xiao Hua who was standing aside. Pin-er understood that they urgently needed help. Having already run to help, she was tried to be stopped by Hua, who hesitantly said that she would kill Jiang. Pin replied that at the moment they definitely could not win, and asked her to retreat. Their dialogue was interrupted by someone's loud laughter. They turned around and were perplexed by what they saw. Having come to his senses, Capet suddenly acquired some kind of power, with the help of which he scattered everyone to the sides. Everyone was in bewilderment. Capet angrily looked into Kur's eyes and said that he wanted to take away his energy. And he added that he would provide access to all available energy. Capet literally sparkled with lightning enveloping his body. At that moment, he directed a huge clot of energy in the form of an electric ball at Kurtz, inside which Kurtz rose to the heights. Everyone stood and watched what was happening. Suddenly Kurtz landed on the ground and stood immobilized for several seconds. Then, smiling, he said that his body can withstand and absorb more than 100 million units of energy, and it won't kill him like that. Nobody knew what to do, and what was going on. Had Kurtz really become so strong? Kurtz asked what happened to their faces, then added that they should feel fear from his power. Xiao Nian replied that they were already scared. Kurtz looked at her indignantly. At this time, the inexplicable began to happen to Kurtz. It was as if he was turning into a big monster. Capet noted that 100 million is not a lot, and people in this world have upper limits, but Capet said that he is not a person. He introduced himself as a god who wants to lead this world to a new path of civilization, and nothing can stop him. Kurtz in turn asked him what his limit was and how strong he was. Capet casually replied that about 1 trillion units of energy, adding that at the moment it is not important. Everyone in the room was shocked by his statement. Ji and Fei Hong noticed that they could not move, something immobilized them. After which Capet asked them if they had warmed up well, hinting that they could not cope with him. Kurtz at this time suddenly began to ignite with an unknown force. His body was engulfed in a huge fireball, thereby demoralizing him. Jiang understood that it was necessary to act quickly and decisively. Suddenly the ball exploded, causing a shock wave to hit the others. The frightened guards fled in horror in different directions. The explosion was too strong, and therefore destroyed the tower in which they were located, and from which a certain ray could be seen going into the sky and therefore into outer space, leaving behind only ruins, among which lay Ji and the rest of the participants in the events. And only Capet walked among the ruins, who was surprised that they survived after 1 trillion volume burst of energy. Stepping on Xiao Nian, he said that there is value in studying this. Suddenly Capet felt something, and then heard a certain rustling behind him. He began to realize that someone else was alive. Capet turned around. It was Xiao Hua behind whom stood an unknown monster. He demanded to remove the leg from her sister. Just as Capet wanted to urge her to calm down, a familiar voice called out to him from the other side. This time he was in for a surprise from Jiang, who took out her sword and threatened him. Her eyeballs were black. She was clearly not herself, from the fact that Capet had harmed the teacher. Hua said that she would not allow it, since this was her goal of the task. Pinger replied that in that case she would kill Xiao Hua too. Jiang declared that the one who was first will get everything, and rushed towards Capet. The Hua monster also ran towards him, but Capet activated the shield and said that of all sins, only stupidity is unforgivable. Jiang replied that it was stupid to take her as a subordinate. Interrupting them, Hua urged them to fight. Pin asked not to waste her time. At this time, the monster tried in vain to break through Capet's shield. Behind, just as unsuccessfully, Pinger Jiang made her way with the help of a sword. Capet also noticed that Ji and Fei Hong began to come to their senses. Li asked Ji who she is. This is Jiang, who has such enormous energy. He caught himself thinking that he was also interested in knowing this. Nian asked Xiao Hua to retreat, as she could not withstand another blow. With great effort, the raised Xiao Nian tried to do something. At this moment, the monster, with joint efforts with Jiang, still broke through Capet's shield. An explosion occurred, as a result of which everyone was thrown to the sides. Li Feihong cried out that they had finally succeeded. Ji, in turn, was in no hurry to draw conclusions. At this time they realized that large-scale changes had not occurred. They saw how Capet grabbed Pinner and pressed a living monster to the ground. He said that they underestimated his power. Capet called on them to become useful to him, in what he thought was an ideal plan. He pressed the monster harder, thereby causing damage to Xiao Hua. Nian was worried. Xiao Nian tried to explain to Hua that they could not continue the mission further, since her strength was running out. Nian told Capet that this time they would admit defeat and give up. She asked him to be allowed to leave this location as soon as possible. At that moment, she felt a wild pain, discovering that a sword had pierced her body. Shocked, Xiao Hua watched what was happening and did not know what to do. Xiao Nian urged her to quickly run away before it was too late. Hua frantically began to imagine what Nian was waiting for next, but she still could not influence the situation. The sword sticking out of her back gradually began to corrode Xiao Nian's body. Capet, pleased with himself, said that he did not allow them to leave. The immobilized Jiang said that he was a scoundrel, adding that this was the last loophole. Mask Ji suggested that Capet was on the 4th level. Li noted that without loopholes it would not be so easy to take control of the rights. Ji said that there was another quite effective method. Fei Hong asked him to quickly tell what it was. He told Li that if he wanted to know, he should come closer, but if he died it would be on his conscience. Fei Hong came as close as possible to Ji, who whispered something in his ear. Holding Jiang, Capet said that they had no chance. Pinner said that she could help them. At that moment, Xiaohua sharply demanded that her sister be returned to her. Capet turned around. Hua swung at him, he restrained her hand, noting that her situation was stalemate, but she still wanted her partner back. Continuing to hold Ping with one hand, he held back Hua with the other. Suddenly, Xiaohua began to transform into something inexplicable. Having finally turned into a huge monster, Hua again demanded that he return Yen. Xiaohua, in the form of a monster, attacked Capet, who did not expect such a transformation from her. Flying back to the side, he finally released Ping Jiang from his hand, which, in turn, Wu Ji managed to pick up in his arms, which made her pleasantly surprised. Jiang asked the teacher for forgiveness for not being able to help him. Ji replied that she had already done a lot for him, and asked her not to do anything more. At that moment, Hua, in the form of a monster, made her way through Capet's shield. She thought that the teacher could also go to his death, and she reproached herself for her weakness, because if she had more energy, she could significantly help him. After some time, Hua was still able to break through another Capet shield, after which she struck him with a strong blow, thereby throwing him back. Capet said that she can beat him as much as she wants as long as he accumulates energy. Standing in front of her at his full height, he confidently declared that he was immortal. Standing behind him, Ji asked if the energy stops being replenished, what then? Capet turned to Fei Hong and Wu Ji who were looking at him smiling. He said that this is the funniest joke in this world, which is quite difficult to believe. Still grinning, Ji persistently asked him if he was so sure of this. Suddenly, the energy gradually began to drain from Capet's eyes. He was stunned by what was happening, not believing that his energy point was irrevocably disappearing. Fei Hong said that his plan worked, and finally everything will end. Ji replied that this is karma. Broken Capet, in a trembling voice, asked what they had done. Joyful Fei Hong cried out that this is the case when the joke came true. Suddenly, Hua, who was behind her in the body of a monster, stepped on Capet, thereby pinning him to the ground. Jiang couldn't understand how the teacher knew, because she didn't have time to tell him. Ji replied that Kurz and Mr. E talk about it. She finally realized that they were all ruined by inaction. Li, in turn, noted that the good guy gave people the choice to remain under control or become free, and applied the live broadcast of this world, adding that the result was this degenerate. At this time Hua continued to beat Capet. Jiang assumed that the teacher's mission was completed. Ji interrupted her and said that nothing exists more important than life. At this moment, Capet thanked them, trying to hold back another blow from Hua. He ended up spending all his accumulated energy points on the ability, and he appeared before them in the form of a giant robot, saying that for the first time someone forced him to reveal this card. Fei Hong noticed that he was still magnificent, while Capet hurried to deal with the monster Hua. Ji and Pinger watched as he easily brought the monster to the ground. Capet said that their minds are not able to understand what is happening. While firing the cannon at Xiaohua, he continued to say that he absorbed not only the energy, but also their external equipment. He would have let them live, but they thwarted his perfect plan by sneaking behind his back. Ji asked Capet if he was able to absorb their inner part at the same time. He praised Ji for his intelligence, while simultaneously pointing his weapon at the same Xiaohua. Having fired again, he added that their anger in its original form poured into his mechanism. He had never been as strong as he is now, after which he slowly walked towards them. He looked at them menacingly and said that this all happened only thanks to them. Fei Hong suggested that Ji surrender, but the teacher categorically disagreed with this, urging him to fight to the last. Capet, standing opposite them in the form of a robot, pointed his cannon at them and said that he would remember their last words. Finally, he fired a projectile at Ji and Fei Hong, who in turn hurried to dodge. Capet said that it was too late and useless to run away, since their death was irreversible. Wu Ji noticed that the enraged Capet rushed after him. Ji still tried to resist him, and taking out his sword, dealt a sharp and powerful blow. Capet again repeated that it was useless. He repelled his attack with lightning speed, the sword flew far to the side, Ji also could not stay on his feet. At that moment, Capet saw that Fei Hong and Jiang rushed at him. He laughed and said that ants always act as a team. He simultaneously struck both Fei Hong and Pinger with both hands. Li easily dodged the metal fist and grabbed it with both hands, thereby trying to fix it. Jiang Pinger also successfully jumped away from his second iron hand. She climbed on him and wrapped her legs and arms around his head. Fei Hong continued to hold back his hand. Capet said that this would not help them. Li Fei Hong urged Wu Ji to immediately take action, because he understood that it would not be possible to hold Capet for long. Suddenly his body again acquired a human appearance. Capet was in disbelief, his energy disappeared in an instant, changing his essence. Wu Ji said that in his world there is such an expression as home advantage, since he believed that his energy was many times better than theirs. At this time, Fei Hong used the ability, changing the structure of the material. Jiang, in turn, used the skill, animism. In the end, with joint efforts, they tied him up, as if mummifying him with some red thread. Capet in response wished them death. All together they stood opposite the immobilized Capet, and could not believe their eyes. Was it really all over? The delightedly Fei Hong shouted that they had finally succeeded, and they had defeated this villain Capet. Wu Ji offered to send him on his last and irrevocable journey, so that he could never bother anyone again. At this moment, a message was displayed stating that the task was completed and the transfer would be activated in 10 seconds. Fei Hong managed to notice that animism can be equated to death, and it is effective in any world, adding that Wu Ji is very talented. Suddenly, a level 4 threat was highlighted, and that an immortal was born. There were only 9 seconds left before the transfer. Pinger Jiang didn't understand what was happening, what other 4th level threat could be, and what kind of immortal was born. She saw concern in the eyes of her teacher and Fei Hong, and therefore asked why they were looking at her like that. At this time, Jiang felt something, and looked down to find that her torso was cut off from the rest of her body. She slowly slid down to the ground, while a smiling and at the same time embittered Capet rose behind her, in whose hands there was a bloody sword. He was pleased with himself, and looked arrogantly into their eyes. There were only 8 seconds left before the transfer. Ji and Li Fei Hong had no idea what could be done in this time.